Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let this story guide you into a restful, deep sleep. I moved into an old farmhouse. The walls won't stop whispering at night. It was late October when I arrived in a small, forgotten town in Vermont called Cedar Hollow. The air was crisp, the trees were ablaze with shades of orange and red, and the entire countryside looked like a scene out of a postcard. I had been looking for a fresh start after my divorce, and the old farmhouse on Briar Ridge Road seemed like the perfect place to find it. The house was over a century old, with peeling white paint, a creaky front porch, and shutters that rattled in the wind. The realtor, a cheerful older woman named Linda, assured me it had character. "It's got a charm all its own," she said with a smile, handing me the keys. "And don't mind the stories people tell around here. Old houses like this always come with a bit of history." I didn't ask her what she meant. Maybe I should have. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time unpacking boxes, fixing minor repairs, and exploring the sprawling property. The house sat on 10 acres of overgrown fields and woods, with no neighbors in sight. At night, the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the wind whistling through the eaves. It was peaceful, or so I thought. The whispers started on the fourth night. It was around 2 a.m., and I had just drifted off to sleep when I heard it. Faint, unintelligible murmurs, like the hum of a distant conversation. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish for talking to an empty room. The whispers stopped abruptly. I grabbed a flashlight and walked through the house, checking every room. The hardwood floors creaked beneath my feet, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light. Nothing was out of place, but the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Lack of sleep, stress, or maybe even the old house settling. But when it happened again the following night, I knew it wasn't my imagination. This time, the whispers were louder. They seemed to echo through the walls, an eerie cacophony of voices overlapping one another. I couldn't make out any specific words, but there was a distinct sense of urgency in their tone, like they were trying to warn me of something. "Who's there?" I demanded, pressing my ear against the cold plaster in the hallway. The voices stopped again, leaving me in a deafening silence. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers came every night, always between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., and always from different parts of the house. I tried recording them with my phone, but the playback captured nothing but static. One evening, desperate for answers, I called Linda. She seemed hesitant at first, but after some coaxing, she admitted there were rumors about the house. They say the original owner, a man named Samuel Hargrove, went mad, she told me over the phone. He disappeared one winter back in 1892, and no one ever found him. Some folks claim he's still here, watching. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. I could barely stand it. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls, the floorboards, even the ceiling. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were murmurs, overlapping and growing in intensity, like a crowd gathering right outside my door. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the flashlight in one hand and an old wooden bat I'd found in the barn in the other. The clock on my bedside table read 2:47 a.m., and I knew I couldn't just sit there and endure it. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The voices fell silent, completely, chillingly silent. Then, 3 distinct knocks echoed from the wall directly behind me. Asterisk knock. Knock. Knock asterisk. I jumped up, spinning around with the flashlight, and aimed it at the wall. It was just a wall, chipped paint and all. But those knocks had been real. I took a deep breath and pressed my ear against the cold surface. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just my own breathing and the faint hum of the wind outside. But then I heard it. Asterisk help us, asterisk. The words were barely audible, but they were clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It wasn't just one voice. It was several, layered over each other, pleading. "Help us," they repeated, louder this time. "Who are you?" I whispered, my throat dry. The wall didn't answer. Instead, the whispers began to move, as if they were traveling through the house. I followed them, clutching the flashlight tightly as I made my way through the dark hallway. The house felt colder than usual, the air heavy and oppressive. I could hear the voices leading me, growing louder as I descended the creaky staircase to the first floor. They stopped abruptly when I reached the kitchen. There, in the middle of the floor, was something I hadn't noticed before. The old wooden planks seemed slightly uneven, as if one of them didn't quite fit. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edges, finding a small groove. My heart pounded as I realized what it was. A trapdoor. I hesitated for a long moment, the whispers swirling faintly around me now, urging me on. "Help us," they repeated. I pried open the trapdoor with the flashlight handle, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. A cold, musty smell wafted up from below, like damp earth and decaying wood. "Why am I doing this?" I muttered to myself, but some unseen force seemed to pull me forward. I grabbed a lantern from the kitchen counter, one of the old ones left behind by the previous owner, and lit it before stepping cautiously down into the cellar. The staircase groaned under my weight, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the light of the lantern. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, I was shivering. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, with low stone walls and a dirt floor. Rusted tools and broken furniture were scattered around, but what caught my attention was the far corner. There, against the wall, was a mound of dirt that looked freshly disturbed. The whispers returned, louder now and more frantic. "Help us! Find us!" I froze, my lantern shaking in my hand. The mound of dirt seemed to shift slightly, as if something beneath it was moving. That's when I saw it. A single skeletal hand poking out from the soil. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I stared at the skeletal hand protruding from the dirt. The whispers grew deafening now, a chaotic swirl of voices repeating the same desperate plea. "Help us! Free us!" The hand wasn't moving, but it felt alive somehow, as if it had been waiting for me to see it. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of that cellar and never look back. But my body didn't obey. Instead, I found myself stepping forward, closer to the mound. I knelt down and hesitantly reached out to brush some of the loose dirt away from the hand. My fingers trembled as I worked, uncovering more of the brittle, yellowed bones. Beneath the dirt was what looked like an entire skeleton, curled into a fetal position. Then I saw something else, something that made my stomach turn. The skeleton's jaw was open, and clutched tightly between its teeth was a small, rusted key. I froze, unsure of what to do. The whispers grew more insistent, almost angry now, echoing through the cellar. Asterisk, take it. Take the key, asterisk. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, I don't know what this is. I can't. The lantern flickered suddenly, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could feel a presence behind me. Something cold and oppressive watching me. Asterisk, take it, asterisk, the voices demanded, more forceful this time. With shaking hands, I reached out and plucked the key from the skeleton's jaw. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt deafening. I stood there, clutching the key, my heart pounding in my chest. The cellar felt different now, heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. Upstairs, the house was eerily quiet. I stood in the kitchen, trying to catch my breath, the key cold and heavy in my hand. It was small, old, and rusted, with strange, intricate carvings etched into its surface. I didn't know what it was for, but I had the sinking feeling I was going to find out whether I wanted to or not. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, staring at the key and waiting for something, anything, to happen. At exactly 3 a.m., the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from upstairs. The whispers upstairs were different. They weren't faint or scattered like before. They were deliberate, focused, and chillingly clear. It sounded like someone was pacing above me, murmuring in a low, guttural tone. I gripped the key tightly in one hand and grabbed the wooden bat again with the other. My legs felt like lead as I climbed the creaking staircase, each step bringing me closer to the voices. You took it. You took the key. The words slithered through the air like smoke, wrapping around me. I stopped halfway up, my breath catching in my throat. Who are you? I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The voices didn't reply directly. Instead, they seemed to shift, becoming a chorus of indistinct murmurs again, pulling me toward the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and a pale, flickering light spilled out from inside. I hadn't left any lights on. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I pushed the door open. The room was freezing, the kind of cold that felt alive, biting at my skin even through my clothes. The lantern on the bedside table was somehow lit, its weak yellow flame casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And in the center of the room on the floor was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a man, or what was left of him. His gaunt, translucent figure was crouched over something, his bony fingers digging into the floorboards. He wore tattered clothing from another era, and his face was sunken hollow. He turned his head slowly to look at me, and I felt my stomach drop. His eyes, or where his eyes should have been, were empty, black pits. You took it, he rasped, his voice reverberating unnaturally through the room. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. He gestured to the floor beneath him, where he had been digging. The boards were cracked and splintered, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside it was a small, intricately carved wooden box. You brought it back, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Finish it. Finish what? I asked, my voice shaking. Instead of answering, he pointed to the key in my hand. The whispers around me swelled, growing louder and more frantic, urging me forward. My body seemed to move on its own as I knelt beside the figure, avoiding his hollow gaze. The box looked ancient, its surface covered in the same strange carvings as the key. My hands trembled as I fit the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "Don't," a new voice hissed. I froze. This voice was different, sharp, commanding, and distinctly female. It seemed to cut through the cacophony of whispers like a knife. "Don't open it," she warned. I looked up, but there was no one else in the room. The figure in front of me had gone still, his empty eyes locked on the box. The whispers grew louder, drowning out the warning. My fingers twisted the key, and the lock clicked open. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced like they were alive. The air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating, and the figure let out a low, guttural growl. The box creaked open. Inside was something I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't an object, it was movement. Shadows twisted and writhed inside the box, shifting shapes that seemed to defy logic. My eyes burned just looking at it, and I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and filled with rage. The figure lunged at me, his bony hands reaching for the box. The figure's cold, skeletal hands clawed at the box, his movements frantic and jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. I scrambled backward, clutching the box against my chest, the shadows inside writhing more violently as if they were trying to escape. "You don't understand," the figure roared, his voice a guttural, otherworldly growl. "Close it, before it's too late." The screams from the walls erupted again, a horrifying cacophony of voices filled with anguish and fury. The entire house seemed to shudder, the floorboards creaking and groaning as if the building itself was alive and angry. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed to close the box, but something about the whispers, those desperate pleas I'd been hearing for days, held me frozen. "Finish it," the voices demanded once more, louder and more insistent. The figure lunged at me again, and this time his skeletal fingers wrapped around my wrist. His touch was ice cold, and the strength in his grip was terrifyingly real. He dragged me toward him, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You don't know what you've unleashed," he hissed. "It's not what they told you. You must seal it. Now!" "Who are you?" I shouted, struggling to free myself. "What is this?" But before he could answer, the shadows inside the box exploded outward. It was like a black, seething smoke, swirling and expanding until it filled the entire room. The air turned icy, and the light from the lantern was snuffed out instantly, plunging me into complete darkness. The screams grew louder, not just from the walls but from within the shadows themselves. Shapes moved within the blackness, twisted, humanoid forms with glowing red eyes, their mouths gaping in silent agony. The figure let go of me and stumbled back, his gaunt face twisted in horror. "Asterisk, you've doomed us all, asterisk," he whispered before the shadows engulfed him completely. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, suffocating and alive, pressing against my skin like cold, wet hands. My mind raced, panic overtaking any rational thought. "Seal it! Seal it!" the female voice from before screamed, cutting through the chaos. With trembling hands, I grabbed the lid of the box and slammed it shut. For a moment, everything stopped. The shadows vanished, the screams faded, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. I was left sitting in the middle of the room, clutching the now closed box, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The lantern flickered back to life, its weak glow casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The figure was gone, and the floor where he'd been crouching was nothing but undisturbed wood. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, softer, almost like a low hum, but they were still there, coming from the box. I stared at it, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The carvings on its surface seemed to shimmer faintly in the lantern light, as if they were alive. Then, from the hallway outside the room, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. The footsteps were steady and deliberate, each one echoing louder than the last. I froze, clutching the box to my chest, the whispers inside now faint but still persistent. Whoever or whatever was coming up those stairs wasn't in a hurry. The house was silent except for those footsteps, each one creaking against the old wooden boards. I strained to listen, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of that slow, rhythmic approach. And then they stopped, right outside the bedroom door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The doorknob rattled slightly, as if someone or something was testing it. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, reaching out toward the door like black tendrils. I took a step back, my back pressing against the far wall. The whispers inside the box grew louder again, insistent and frantic, almost as if they were warning me. "Stay away," I whispered to the door, though I wasn't sure who or what I was talking to. The knob twisted slowly. I gripped the box tighter and scanned the room for anything I could use to defend myself. The wooden bat was still at my feet, but I wasn't sure it would make a difference. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't human. The door creaked open. First, there was nothing, just darkness spilling into the room from the hallway. But then, a figure stepped inside. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the top of the doorframe. Its form was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct, but its eyes burned like embers, glowing a deep, malevolent red. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there, staring, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers inside the box turned into screams. "Give it to me," the figure said, its voice low and rumbling, like the sound of distant thunder. I shook my head instinctively, clutching the box tighter. "No," I stammered. "I don't even know what this is." "Give it to me," it repeated, louder this time. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of its voice, dust falling from the ceiling. I took a step back, my legs trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. The figure moved closer, its elongated shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing the light from the lantern. "Why do you want it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the question. "It does not belong to you," it said, "and it cannot stay in your hands." The box began to vibrate in my grip, the carvings glowing faintly now, pulsing like a heartbeat. The whispers inside became more frenzied, overlapping and urgent, though I still couldn't make out the words. "What happens if I don't give it to you?" I asked, my voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a long, spindly hand and pointed at me. Suddenly, the room began to warp. The walls stretched and twisted, the air growing heavy and thick. The lantern's light flickered wildly, casting chaotic, shifting shadows. I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was trying to crush me from the inside. And then I heard it, a single voice, clear and piercing, cutting through the chaos. "Don't trust it." The voice was coming from the box. The voice from the box froze me in place. It wasn't like the whispers before. This voice was sharp, commanding, and eerily human. It repeated itself louder this time. "Don't trust it. Don't let it take the box." The figure, now looming just a few feet away, flinched at the sound of the voice. Its red, ember-like eyes narrowed, and its shadowy form seemed to ripple with anger. "You have no idea what you're holding," it growled, its voice reverberating through the room. You cannot control it, but I can. The box trembled violently in my hands, the glow from the carvings intensifying. The whispers inside had returned, desperate and pleading, but the voice, the clear human voice, cut through them again. It's lying to you, the figure snarled, its spindly fingers twitching as if it were barely holding itself back. The pressure in the room grew unbearable, the walls groaning as if the house itself was being twisted and torn apart. What do? I shouted, my voice cracking. I didn't know who I was asking, the voice, the figure, myself. Keep it sealed, the voice from the box said firmly. And do not give it up. Not to this thing. The figure lunged suddenly, faster than I could react. Its hand shot out toward the box, but just before it could touch it, a bright, searing light erupted from the carvings. The figure recoiled with a deafening screech, its shadowy form disintegrating around the edges as it staggered back. The light grew brighter, illuminating the room in an otherworldly glow. You fool! The figure roared, its voice filled with rage and desperation. You've bound yourself to it now. It will destroy you. The box's light pulsed, sending out waves of energy that shook the entire house. The figure dissolved further, its form breaking apart like ash in the wind. Before it disappeared completely, it hissed one final warning. It will never let you go. And then it was gone. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the lantern's flame steadied once more. I collapsed to the floor, the box still clutched tightly in my hands. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the voice from the box spoke again, calm and measured this time. It is not finished. You must listen carefully. I stared down at the box, my heart pounding. Who are you? I whispered. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it said, Asterisk, you have opened the door. And now you must close it. For good, Asterisk. What door? I asked, my voice barely audible. The one they were trying to keep shut. Before I could ask more, the box began to shift in my hands. The carvings rearranged themselves, forming a new pattern, a map. It showed a location somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Take it there, the voice commanded. Bury it where it belongs, and do not look back. I stared at the box as the carvings solidified into a map, intricate and detailed, with no markings except a single glowing symbol, a circle etched deep into the wood. It pulsed faintly, as if alive, over a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The voice inside the box repeated its command. Take it there. Bury it. Do not look back. My mind raced with questions. Why me? Why was this happening? But deep down, I knew that staying in this house was no longer an option. The figure's words haunted me. It will never let you go. The air in the house felt different now, still and heavy, as though the building itself were holding its breath. I glanced out the window. The first rays of dawn were breaking, casting a pale orange glow over the fields. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into a backpack, water, food, a flashlight, and the small wooden bat I'd been clinging to for dear life. The box, now cool to the touch, went into a separate bag, wrapped in layers of cloth to muffle its vibrations. Before leaving, I hesitated at the front door, turning back to look at the house. It was quiet now, the whispers silenced, but the air still felt charged, as if something was watching. I'm not coming back, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it was a promise or a plea. The drive was long and eerily uneventful. The route on the box's map led me deep into the Appalachians, far from any towns or major roads. The narrow, winding paths grew more treacherous the further I went, the trees closing in like a canopy, their branches skeletal against the gray winter sky. By the time I reached the spot marked on the map, the sun was beginning to set. The location was a clearing, surrounded by towering pines and shrouded in a strange, unnatural silence. Not even the wind stirred. I stepped out of the car, the box clutched tightly in my hands. The air here felt different, heavier, colder. It was as if the clearing existed outside of time, untouched by the world beyond. The voice in the box spoke again, faint but clear. Dig. I found a spot in the center of the clearing and began to dig with a small folding shovel I'd brought. The earth was hard and unyielding, as if it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. After what felt like hours, the hole was deep enough. I placed the box at the bottom, its carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. But just as I was about to cover it with dirt, the ground beneath me trembled. A low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trees seemed to lean closer, their skeletal branches twisting and writhing as if alive. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, they began to emerge. Figures. They were humanoid, but wrong, elongated limbs, distorted faces, their eyes glowing the same malevolent red as the figure in my house. They moved with unnatural grace, surrounding me in a slow, deliberate circle. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping and chaotic. "It's not safe here," the voice in the box said, sharp and urgent. "Finish it now. Seal it or they'll take you instead." Panic surged through me as the figures closed in, their hollow, twisted faces fixed on me. I grabbed the dirt with trembling hands and began to bury the box as fast as I could. The ground shook harder, and the air filled with a deafening roar. The figures lunged toward me, their distorted forms writhing like smoke. I shoved the last mound of dirt over the box and pressed it down with all my weight. The moment the box was completely buried, the roar stopped. The figures froze, their forms flickering like dying flames, before dissolving into the shadows. The ground steadied, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. I collapsed onto the dirt, gasping for breath. The clearing was silent once more, the only sound my ragged breathing. But the voice wasn't finished. "Leave now," it said, cold and commanding. "And remember, do not look back." I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky but desperate to obey. I made it to the car, started the engine, and began driving without a second thought. As I left the clearing behind, a chill ran down my spine, a nagging pull urging me to look in the rearview mirror. But I didn't. The drive home felt like a blur, the road stretching endlessly before me, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. I barely noticed the hours slipping by, my thoughts trapped in the events of the past days. The figure, the whispers, the box. Everything felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The night had fully fallen by the time I reached the familiar roads near my town. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, like the world around me was holding its breath. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my eyes glued to the road ahead. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The house. At first, I thought it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But no, there it was, standing on the edge of the road, just like I had left it. The windows were dark, but there was something about it. The shape of it, the way it seemed to watch me. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The voice from the box echoed in my mind. "Do not look back." But I couldn't help myself. As I passed the familiar driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. There, in the reflection, standing in the front yard of the house, was a figure. The same figure from the house. The same glowing red eyes, the same hollow face. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the road. But when I whipped my head around to look, The yard was empty. The house was still there, silent. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but this time, nothing. It was just the empty road behind me. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked in the driveway, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I felt eyes on me, even though there was no one there. The cold feeling that had followed me all the way from the mountains was still there, like a shadow lingering just behind me. I went inside, locked the door, and sat down. My hands still trembled from everything I had just experienced. I told myself that I was safe, that it was over, but deep down I knew it wasn't. And as I sat there in the silence, I heard it. A soft, insistent whisper, coming from nowhere. You thought you could escape. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice wasn't in my head this time. It was real. I looked around, but there was no one in the room. And yet, it whispered again. You will never be free. I stood up, my legs unsteady, the whisper still ringing in my ears. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific, just everywhere, like a presence that had settled into the very walls of my apartment. You will never be free. The voice repeated, clearer now, closer, almost like a breath in my ear. I backed away from the walls, trying to pinpoint the source. The chill in the room had grown unbearable, the temperature plummeting as if the shadows themselves were closing in. My breath formed visible clouds in the air, and every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't move. Then I heard it again, louder, more insistent. It's not over. It will never be over. The box. I realized then, with a sickening certainty, that I hadn't truly sealed it away. I had buried it, yes, but somehow it was still here. The box. The thing inside. It wasn't finished with me. I turned toward the small table where I had placed the bag with the box. My heart thudded painfully against my chest as I slowly approached it, the bag seeming to pulse with a life of its own. I hesitated, but I knew, deep down, I couldn't ignore it. I had to open it. As my fingers brushed against the bag, a surge of cold shot through my body, and I stumbled back with a gasp. The box itself was vibrating. I could feel it. The vibrations were subtle at first, like the slow thrum of a distant heartbeat, but they grew stronger until the entire room seemed to tremble. No! I screamed aloud, but my voice barely broke through the heavy silence. I didn't want to open it again. Not after everything that had happened, not after seeing those figures in the clearing. But I couldn't stop. My hand moved of its own accord, reaching for the bag. I pulled it out, the box now feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. The carvings had changed again, glowing brighter, shifting as if something inside was pushing to get out. Stay away from it, I shouted, but the words sounded hollow in the stillness. No one was there to hear me. As I stared at the box, the whispers returned, more frantic now. They were inside my head, swirling, overlapping, impossible to understand. But one voice, the same clear voice I had heard before, cut through the chaos. You're too late. It's already begun. I recoiled from the box as if it had burned me. But it wasn't over. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, a heavy pressure that made it hard to breathe. The walls seemed to close in, distorting, as though the very fabric of the apartment was unraveling. No, I whispered, desperate to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere. The house, the box, it followed me. It would always follow me. The door to my apartment slammed open, but there was no one there. The darkness poured in, swirling like a fog. I felt the temperature drop again, my breath freezing in the air, even though the heat was on. Leave now, the voice inside the box commanded, firm and final. I looked around, my head spinning, but I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the box and ran, bolting out the door and into the hallway, not caring who saw me. I ran down the stairs, out into the parking lot, where the only thing I could focus on was getting in my car and leaving. As I sped away from the apartment, I could still feel the oppressive weight of it all. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but I knew they were still there, just waiting. But as I drove, a realization struck me. The mountains, the place where I buried the box. It wasn't just a grave for the box, it was a prison. I had felt it, the power of the land itself, something ancient and dark, holding whatever had been trapped within. And now it was free. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, no matter how fast I drove or how far I went. The whispering in my head had grown quieter, but it was still there, like a shadow, always lurking in the periphery of my mind, always just on the edge of my awareness. I tried to tell myself it was over. The box was buried. The house was left behind. But I knew better. That thing, that force, wasn't bound by walls or miles of distance. It wasn't a physical presence. It was something older, deeper, something that lived in the very fabric of the world itself. I took the exit toward a nearby town, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy. The streets were deserted, lit by dim streetlights that flickered as I passed, casting eerie shadows across the empty sidewalks. Felt like a ghost town. I pulled into a small motel and parked in front of a room near the back, hoping to get some rest. I didn't sleep. The second my head hit the pillow, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like the rustle of wind through trees, but slowly growing louder, more insistent. My heart began to race, my body trembling beneath the sheets. It wasn't in my head anymore. It was outside, around me, filling the room with a presence I couldn't escape. I sat up, gasping for air, but when I looked around, the room was still. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything felt wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room were too deep, too sharp, as if they were hiding something. I heard a thud from the window. My breath caught in my throat. I moved cautiously to the window and peered outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty parking lot, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the cracked asphalt. And then, in the corner of the lot, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and shadowed, standing motionless beneath a flickering street lamp. Its form was indistinct, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were glowing just like the figure in the house, the same ember-red hue, burning with malice. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers grew louder, closer, almost drowning out everything else. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the box or if they were inside my mind. I turned to the bag, the box still wrapped tightly inside. My hands trembled as I unzipped it, the familiar weight of the box pressing against my palm. "Leave me alone," I whispered, but it was no use. The figure outside began to move, its long, distorted limbs shifting as it glided closer. I could feel its presence in my bones, its hunger for the box, for whatever it contained. The voice inside the box spoke again, low and urgent. "You must destroy it. Cannot be allowed to reach you." But how? I had already buried it. I had already done everything it had asked. Was there no end to this nightmare? Was there no escape? The figure was now standing directly beneath my window, staring up at me, its eyes burning through the glass like a heat that radiated into my very soul. My pulse quickened as I stumbled backward, unable to tear my eyes away from its gaze. Then, the whispers became a chorus, dozens of voices all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with an undeniable sense of dread. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the air itself had been stolen from me. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. The figure outside was gone. The whispers ceased. I was left in an unnatural stillness, the weight of the silence suffocating. My body was frozen, caught between terror and disbelief. What had just happened? I took a shaky breath, trying to gather my thoughts. The room was empty. The figure had vanished, but I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't finished with me, and if I didn't find a way to end this once and for all, I would never be free. I had no idea how I was going to do it, but I couldn't keep running. Not anymore. The box, the figure, the whispers, they were all part of something much bigger than me. And if I didn't destroy it now, I might never escape its grip. I couldn't stay in that motel room any longer. It felt as though the walls were closing in, suffocating me with every breath I took. The figure had disappeared, but I knew it wouldn't be long before it returned. It always did. The longer I stayed, the more the oppressive silence began to feel like a trap, like I was waiting for something to pounce. I grabbed the box, wrapping it carefully in a cloth again, and threw it into my bag. But this time it felt heavier. The weight of it was dragging me down, as if it had become a part of me, a dark presence that clung to my soul. I had to end it. There was no other choice. I left the room, slammed the door behind me, and got into my car. As I started the engine and drove, the weight of the road ahead seemed endless. I didn't know where I was going exactly, but somewhere deep inside, I knew I had to return to where it all started, the clearing in the mountains. That was the only place where I might be able to stop this once and for all. The drive back was silent. My mind kept racing, jumping between thoughts of what I had already done and what I still had to do. The box, the figure, the whispers, the shadows. It was all leading back to that spot in the Appalachians, as though the land itself held the key to everything. By the time I reached the mountain pass, the sun was already beginning to dip beneath the horizon. The sky had darkened into a deep purple, and the shadows stretched longer across the road. The air felt colder now, heavier, like the mountain itself was breathing down on me. I followed the winding road up to the clearing, the headlights of my car cutting through the growing darkness. When I reached it, the familiar silence wrapped around me once again, but it was different this time. The air felt thick, charged, as if the land was waiting, holding its breath. I parked the car and got out, taking the box with me. The clearing was the same as it had been before, but now it felt alive. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, and the ground felt soft under my feet, like it was pulsing with something just beneath the surface. The figure, it had to be here somewhere. I stepped into the center of the clearing, my heart pounding, and knelt down to dig. The earth was colder this time, harder, as though resisting me, but I kept going. My hands bled from the sharp edges of rocks and roots as I dug deeper and deeper. The further I went, the more the whispers seemed to intensify, curling into my ears, telling me to stop, to leave, to let it go. But I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached the spot where I had buried the box before. I pulled it out of the hole with trembling hands and opened it. The moment I did, the ground trembled. The whispers became screams. A dark, roiling mist poured out from the box, thick and heavy, swirling around my feet. I could feel the temperature drop even further, the air turning bitter and sharp, cutting into my skin. And then I saw it, the figure. It was no longer the shadowy, disjointed creature I had seen before. Now it stood before me in full form, its long, twisted limbs extending out of the mist, its face a mask of agony, with eyes glowing with an unbearable hunger. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one longer than the last. It didn't move toward me, though. Instead, it raised one hand and pointed directly at me. "You should not have come back," it whispered, its voice low and guttural. "Now you will join us." I tried to run, but the ground beneath me seemed to twist and warp, pulling me deeper into the earth. My legs sank, my feet were trapped in the mud, and the mist swirled around me, choking me with every breath I tried to take. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, hundreds, all crying out in agony, begging for release, begging for salvation. The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes never leaving mine, and I could feel its presence consuming everything. My thoughts, my fears, my will. Then the voice from the box came again. It wasn't calm this time. It was frantic. "Destroy it. Now!" I didn't know how I could, but I knew this was my only chance. I reached into the bag and grabbed the box, but as soon as my fingers touched it, the carvings on its surface began to glow brightly, almost blindingly so. The energy that surged from it felt like fire in my hands, and I screamed in pain as the box seemed to resist, as if it were fighting to stay open. "Seal it again," the voice urged, now desperate. With everything I had left, I forced the box shut, and the instant it closed, the world around me seemed to snap back into place. The mist disappeared, and the figure let out a scream that shattered the air, its form dissolving into smoke. I was gasping for breath, my body shaking from the strain of it all. The clearing was silent again, the oppressive weight lifting from my shoulders. But I knew, deep inside, that the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I could barely stand. My legs felt like rubber, my chest tight with the remnants of the fear that still gripped me. But I knew, I knew, that this was only temporary. Whatever dark force I had unleashed in that box was far from finished with me. The figure, the whispers, the mist, they were all part of something ancient and malevolent, something that didn't care about boundaries or time. I had merely delayed the inevitable. The box in my hands was silent now, but its weight, its cold, suffocating weight, told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't done. Whatever force had been trapped inside was still pushing against the edges, fighting to get out. I could feel it, seeping into my skin like poison, spreading through me, sinking into my bones. I couldn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't stay anywhere familiar. The box had already made it clear that wherever I went, it would follow. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. The miles stretched endlessly before me, the roads twisting in the darkness as I fled. The world outside seemed unreal, like it had been pulled into some kind of warped dream, the trees flickering past like shadows. I needed to get away from the mountains, away from the clearing. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, watching me, waiting for me to stop. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A figure, standing by the side of the road, tall, gaunt, the same glowing red eyes, the same hollow face. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I whipped my head around. But there was nothing there when I looked, just the empty road. I glanced back again. It was still there, closer now, like it was moving toward me. I floored the accelerator, pushing the car faster, but the figure was following me, always just a step behind. I couldn't outrun it. The more I tried, the closer it got. The car felt like it was trapped in a web, caught in some otherworldly force that pulled me back every time I tried to escape. I didn't know how long I drove, but eventually, the car sputtered to a stop. My gas tank was empty. Panic surged through me. I was in the middle of nowhere. No one around for miles. No shelter. No escape. I looked around frantically, my mind racing. There had to be something, some way out of this. And then I saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin. It wasn't far, just off the road. Its silhouette barely visible in the dim light, but it was enough. Maybe it would be enough to hide. I stumbled out of the car, the box still clutched tightly in my hands, and ran toward the cabin. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached for the door, pulling it open with trembling hands. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the shape of old furniture, dusty, abandoned. The air was musty, thick with the smell of rot. Felt wrong, but it was better than standing out in the road. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my breathing ragged as I leaned against it, trying to steady myself. The cabin felt cold, unnaturally so, like the walls were frozen in time. The box was still in my hands, and even now, I could feel it calling to me. That's when I heard it again. The whispering. Only this time it wasn't in my head. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. It was everywhere. A chorus of voices, each one more frantic than the last. You cannot escape. I turned toward the far corner of the cabin, where a dim light flickered. There, on the floor, was something. A shape. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then it moved. I took a step back, my heart hammering as the shape shifted, coalescing into a figure. A woman, but not a woman. Her face was twisted, her eyes sunken, her lips pulled back in a grotesque grin. You shouldn't have come here. Her voice was soft, but filled with an awful finality. This place is a door, and now that you've opened it, there's no going back. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the room had frozen me in place, holding me captive, waiting for something. She raised a hand, and the walls seemed to pulse, vibrating with an unseen energy. This world is not what you think it is. You've awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. The door has opened, and now you will walk through it. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to scream for help, but I knew deep down there was no help coming. This wasn't something you could outrun. This was something ancient, something beyond anything I had ever imagined. I looked down at the box in my hands. The carvings on it were glowing again, brighter now, the pulsing light filling the room, filling my eyes. I knew I had to do something. But what? You have one choice, the woman's voice echoed, colder now. Destroy it, or be destroyed. And just as I was about to make my choice, the floor beneath me gave way. The world tilted, and I felt myself falling, the floor crumbling beneath my feet. I tumbled into blackness, the box clutched tightly in my arms, and for a moment, I was weightless, floating in the darkness, suspended between realms. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing, but all I could hear was the whispering, louder now, angrier. You cannot escape. The words echoed in every direction, like 1,000 voices swirling around me, pressing in from all sides. Then, with a sharp jolt, I hit the ground. I gasped, the wind knocked out of me, and I scrambled to push myself up, the box still pressed to my chest. The air was thick, stale, and cold, unnaturally cold. It smelled of damp earth and decay. I was no longer in the cabin, no longer even on solid ground. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. My breath fogged in the air, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Just ahead, shrouded in shadow, a massive, arching doorway. It was ancient, its stone pillars crumbled with age, covered in twisted vines and dark markings. The doorway loomed before me, as though it had always been there, waiting. And on the other side, I couldn't see anything clearly, just a swirling vortex of shadows that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers were louder now, their voices rising in a crescendo, each one more frantic than the last. I could hear them clearly now, desperate, pleading. Come through, "Come through. Come and join us." I didn't want to go through. I knew better. I understood what this place was. I had to have stumbled into some kind of limbo, some in-between world. This place wasn't just a doorway. It was a prison. And whatever had been locked inside the box was using me. Using my fear to open it. The figure. The woman from the cabin. She was the key. She had known. She had been waiting for me to step into this place. I looked down at the box again. Its surface was now glowing with an unbearable light, pulsing with an energy that felt like it was coming from within, from the very core of the earth. The carvings on it seemed to move, shifting as if alive, as though the box itself was aware of what was happening. The ground beneath me trembled again. I looked up, and there it was, the figure standing at the threshold of the doorway. She was no longer human, her face now a contorted, grotesque mask of hatred, her eyes glowing with the same fiery intensity as the box. "It's too late," she hissed, her voice carrying across the darkness. "You've already opened the door. You cannot turn back now." I wanted to scream, to run, but the fear that gripped me was paralyzing. The whispers were too much. They filled my head, pressed against my skull, as though they were trying to claw their way out. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, breath catching in my throat. A shadow moved in the distance, large and indistinct, but moving closer. And then I saw it, the figure from the clearing. The one with the red eyes. It was standing just a few feet away, its gaunt face twisted in a cruel, malicious grin. It wasn't alone. Behind it, dozens of other figures appeared, emerging from the shadows like a horde of nightmares. All of them with those glowing, fiery eyes, their faces twisted in pain, their bodies bent and broken, reaching out toward me with long, skeletal hands. I stumbled backward, holding the box in front of me like a shield, but it was useless. The box was no longer a safeguard, it was a beacon, calling them all to me. I backed up toward the doorway, my mind screaming for me to turn around, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My feet were frozen to the spot. The figures were closing in. There was nowhere to go. "You have no choice," the woman's voice rang out, cold and final. "The door has opened, and now you belong to us." The figures reached for me, their fingers grazing my skin, cold as death, and I could feel their touch seeping into me. Into my soul star. The fear, the darkness, the hunger, they were all inside me now. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if I was dying or if I was already dead. All I knew was that the doorway behind me pulsed with an ancient energy, and I could feel it pulling me in, dragging me toward the shadows. And then, without warning, I dropped the box. It hit the ground with a sickening thud, the glowing carvings dimming, as though it had lost its power. The figures around me froze, their movements halting as if the world itself had taken a breath. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Then the ground beneath me cracked. The doorway roared to life, its energy surging with a blinding intensity, and the shadows rushed toward me like a tidal wave. The figures shrieked, their voices mingling with the wind, the sound deafening. I could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating me, and in that moment, I realized it wasn't just the box. It was me. I had opened it. I had let them in, and there was no going back. The world seemed to bend and twist, and for a brief, impossible moment, time itself appeared to freeze. I stood there, unable to move, unable to think, as the shadows engulfed me, their cold tendrils wrapping around my body, pulling me toward the doorway. The figures, those twisted, lost souls, reached for me, their eyes burning with an insatiable hunger, their mouths stretching wide in grotesque mockeries of smiles. The air grew thick with a foul stench, like decay and rot, and I could feel it filling my lungs, suffocating me. The whispers were louder now, their voices seeping into my thoughts, each one a scream, a plea, a promise of eternal torment. And then, just like that, I was no longer standing in the clearing. The cabin, the road, the mountain, they were gone. The doorway had swallowed them whole, swallowed me whole, and now there was only darkness. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath as the cold pressed in from all sides, the weight of it crushing me. The figures had vanished, but their presence lingered, watching me, waiting. The box, my box, was gone, but I could still feel it. Its power had seeped into me, into my bones, into my very soul. It was as though I had become a part of it, and it a part of me. I could still hear the whispers, now faint but persistent, like the remnants of a dream I couldn't escape. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere, each one urging me to embrace them, to join them. The figures had left their mark on me, and now I was one of them. The ground beneath me cracked again, and I looked up to see the doorway reappearing, its edges glowing with an otherworldly light. I could hear it, feel it, the call of whatever lay beyond, beckoning me, pulling me toward it. There was no escaping it now, no running, no hiding. I stood shakily, my heart racing as I stepped toward the doorway. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but I knew I couldn't. Not anymore. The doorway had chosen me, and there was no turning back from that. With every step, the shadows grew stronger, thicker, until they wrapped around me like a blanket of darkness, pulling me forward. Then, just as I was about to cross the threshold, I saw her again. The woman, the one from the cabin. She stood before me, her twisted, ghastly form towering over me, her eyes burning with an ancient fury. "You can't run away from this," she whispered, her voice cold and final. "You are already part of it." I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The air around me grew thick, pressing against my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The darkness was closing in, and then the world went silent. The darkness swallowed everything. The silence was deafening. I couldn't move. The shadows, now so dense they seemed to have form and weight, pressed in on me from every direction. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my heart in my ears. It felt as though I had been suspended in time, trapped between life and death, between this world and whatever lay beyond the doorway. Then something shifted. The air around me seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The woman's face twisted into a grin, a knowing, terrible grin, as she stepped closer, her steps echoing in the empty void. "You don't understand, do you?" she whispered, her voice low and mocking. "This was always your fate. You opened the door, and now you belong here." I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body felt like it had turned to stone. The more I struggled, the more I felt myself sinking into the abyss, swallowed by the shadows. And then, just as my mind began to fracture, I felt it. The pull of the doorway. It was no longer a distant force, a beckoning call. It was inside me now, pulling me forward, dragging me toward whatever awaited on the other side. I stepped toward the light, knowing full well that crossing this threshold would mean losing myself, becoming a part of whatever malevolent presence had been trapped here for so long. But I had no choice. The door was already opening. The shadows were already inside me. I took a deep breath, and as I crossed the threshold, everything changed. I wasn't in the clearing anymore. I wasn't even on Earth. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a swirling mist that seemed to stretch on for eternity. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, like I was walking on a cloud, but the weight of despair pressed in from every side. The sky above me was pitch black, filled with swirling stars, distant yet impossibly close. And then, in the distance, I saw it, the shape of the woman, the figures. They were all waiting, their hollow eyes turned toward me, their whispers filling the air like 1,000 voices begging for release. I had joined them, and now I was a part of the darkness. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to get more chilling tales and dark mysteries. Your support helps keep the stories alive. Until next time, stay safe and remember, some doors, once opened, should never be closed.